Hello, and welcome to the fifth installment of the beginning of the end for this final exam in ecology. Today we're going to talk about large-scale patterns of biological diversity, and we're going to think about ecology on a global scale. And I thought a perfect way to start this lecture would be by showing you a map figure from one of my friend and colleagues' most recent papers that just came out. Hopefully that's not cut off in the video. Just came out 4 freaking days ago. A global study of biodiversity. If you remember from like the first or second, no, maybe the lecture we had on animal adaptations, and we talked about those bees that Anthophora puebla that make their nests in rock. This is the guy, Michael Orr, who described that species. He just came out with this new cool paper from his postdoctoral work in China looking at global patterns of bee diversity. And so this is a graph of relative species richness of bees globally, and it's been getting a lot of news press, so I thought I'd put it as the first image on this lecture. Some things we already knew about bee species richness is that they are very diverse in the desert southwest of the United States, and then also down into Mexico. Very diverse here, and there's also a few hotspots of bee biodiversity over here and here. Look at that. Not a lot of bee species that live in the Sahara Desert, but this is just one example, a very recent example of an ecological study of global patterns of biodiversity. So, the biological diversity that's present on planet Earth has not always been the same. You know this. We know this. It's changed a lot. Currently, this is kind of a look at the distribution of biological diversity on Earth right now. This is just the different organismal groups. There's a whole crap ton of beetles on Earth. Dang it, I should have looked up the Darwin quote. Darwin said something about God having an inordinate fondness for beetles because there are so many of them on Earth. I know it's inordinate fondness for beetles, but I can't remember the entire quote. I should put it in this lecture. Oh well, that's because there's a crap ton of beetles. Look at all those species. And then in close second, you have Lepidoptera. I would argue that Hymenoptera, because of the diversity of Braconnid wasps, is probably maybe even more diverse than Coleoptera. We just haven't discovered all of the species yet. Like, I have a species of Braconnid wasp named after me because the person whose dissertation it came from, she ran out of things to name the like 200 species that she described. Because there were so many of them, and those were wasps. Anyway, besides the point. Lots of beetles, lots of plants as well. This is like current species distribution, but as you can see, species diversity has been increasing over time. Again, this is all based on fossil records, so how accurate it is there's a lot of uncertainty about the accuracy of these numbers. So species diversity has been increasing over time, and we're learning more and more species every day as more species keep getting discovered. Like lots of beetles being discovered every year. I would argue that this number is probably, I bet Hymenoptera are going to be pretty close second to Coleoptera in terms of species diversity. Lots of other weird insects we didn't even know about too that are being described each year. So there's lots of organisms on Earth. Let's talk a little bit about how it's changed through geologic time. Over the past 600 million years, species diversity has increased almost continuously since the first organisms appeared in the fossil record. Some of the early organisms that you have are vascular plants. Some of them include coelopsids or ferns. They may have been or related to ferns. Many were extinct by the Devonian though. And then you have pteridophytes with their other types of ferns. Includes horsetails. They flourished during the Carboniferous, but then they decreased during the Triassic. That's what's going on here. And then you have gymnosperms, which were most abundant during the Triassic. And then angiosperms replaced gymnosperms in abundance over the next 100 million years. Here's just an example of one of my favorite angiosperms. This is Passiflora incarnata, which is the maypop passion flower, and it's native to Pennsylvania, and it was growing out at Winnie Palmer this year. Not for very long, but I love passion flower flowers. They're pretty. Passiflora flowers. But there have also been large numbers of extinctions throughout geologic history as well. There was the Permian extinctions. 90% of shallow water marine invertebrates went extinct during the Permian extinction. The Cretaceous extinction is when we lost the dinosaurs, RIP. And then Pleistocene extinction, which isn't on here, it would be like up here. The Pleistocene extinction includes things like woolly mammoths, this dude, giant deer, mastodons, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, and a lot of Pleistocene extinctions were caused by climate change and or hunting, and humans have caused 75% of modern-day extinctions. Boo us. Let's look at a few maps looking at global patterns of species diversity and how they vary geographically. So here's just a map showing species diversity of vascular plants, mammals, birds. Now let's look at these maps and see where some hot spots are. You see some hot spots for vascular plants, kind of through this area in Mesoamerica into South America. You see a lot of overlapping patterns with mammals, and then a slightly lower shift in birds. Think about what might be some environmental factors that might explain these global patterns that you learned about very, very early on this semester. What are some things that you can think of? I will let you think for just a second. Do, 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 do. Aw. Rest in peace, Alec Trebek. Okay, let's do it. Let's talk about them. Some might be climatic factors and position along the equator, so latitude. You can see that 0 on the equator is around here, and you see a lot of species diversity around there. What do we know about the equator? Well, we know that it spends a lot more time being exposed to the sun. It has higher net radiation there that, like we talked about at the beginning of the semester, it has more temperature stability there, and we also see species diversity that correlates with that higher net radiation that's associated with the equator. So that's one thing that might explain these global patterns. What about these patterns of diversity? Actually, this is exactly what I just said. So if you take this same data and you map it by latitude, what you can see is that you see a peak in vascular plants, you see a peak in birds, and in mammals at 0 latitude. We know that's where the equator is. It spends a lot of time being exposed to the sun, and it has very high net radiation because of that. And so you see an association between latitude and species diversity. Now let's talk about some things that kind of break that rule. This is a map looking at larger patterns of species diversity in cactuses. You see less of that pattern here, and why is that? Because, well, even in these areas that have high net radiation, they also have high precipitation. Precipitation is not the kind of environment that cactuses evolve in. They're going to be in drier desert regions, and so you're going to see contrasting patterns with latitude with cactuses because they're dry adapted, right? Let's look at some longitudinal transects of this map looking at latitudinal species diversity. Now you do see this increasing species richness with latitude in North and South America. You see this pattern. But if we were to take like a longitudinal transect elsewhere throughout the globe, you can see a different pattern. So if we take this transect through Europe and Africa, you actually see higher species diversity around 40 north. And then the same thing you see here, you see a more spread out species diversity across a more broad area of latitudes rather than mostly around the equator, as you see at this longitudinal transect. So there are ways to look at global patterns that don't necessarily fit with this latitude and species richness trend. Now, there have been various hypotheses proposed to explain these latitudinal gradients of diversity. There's the idea that the age of a community and the stability of the climate in that community might be part of might explain these latitudinal patterns that we see. Places that tend to have lower species diversity have also experienced dramatic shifts in species distributions due to glacial expansion. So you tend to also see lower species diversity in places that had large glaciers during the last glacial maximum. There weren't a ton of glaciers in the tropics ever, and so while the temperature in those regions changed during glacial cycles, there weren't huge glaciers that were eliminating species diversity, and so it might be because these environments have been more stable for longer, they have higher species diversity. In areas where there's intense glacial expansion, like temperate regions, like where we are actually, in those areas, species that went extinct did so because they weren't able to reach glacial refugia. So the smaller the glacial refugia were, the smaller the species diversity there is now. So that's one possible hypothesis. If we think about, you can also think about the relationship between area and species diversity, which doesn't really hold up so much when you think about land area. This is a map of percentage land area by latitude, and then this is just a map of mammal richness in comparison with land area. You can see there's high land area up here around 50 north, but you have higher mammal richness near the equator. There's not actually that much land coverage along the equator, so that hypothesis doesn't really hold up on land, that there's just more area for species to hold. But that hypothesis does hold up a little bit when we think about ocean diversity. So this might be true for the North and Pacific Ocean. There's really wide coverage in the Pacific and South Ocean, or in the north along the equator for the South and North Pacific Oceans. There's really wide land coverage around the equator. And so that hypothesis might explain species diversity in the Pacific Ocean, but not necessarily the Atlantic. If you look at the equator and the Atlantic Oceans, you see a restriction in coverage of the ocean at the equator there, so there's less of that hypothesis doesn't really hold up in the Atlantic Ocean. But you do see, like if you're accounting for all ocean coverage total by latitude, you do actually see an increase in percentage, but that likely just has to do with how large the Pacific Ocean is relative to the Atlantic Ocean. Another thing that might explain the relationship between area and species diversity, and why species diversity might be higher in tropical areas, is that most of the Earth's surface was tropical or subtropical during the Tertiary, and so the tropics did actually cover most of the Earth's surface very recently, but they don't now. And so if you think about it historically, you might have a relationship between area and species diversity to explain these latitudinal gradients. Now let's talk about how species richness relates to the amount of energy that is available in the environment. We've talked about evapotranspiration before. Now let's talk about it on a global scale. Potential evapotranspiration is the amount of evaporation that would occur if a sufficient water source were available. So it's an index of the integrated thermal energy in the environment. So this is the amount of evaporation that would occur if sufficient water were available. That's potential. In contrast is actual evapotranspiration. This is the flux of water from the terrestrial surface to the atmosphere through evaporation and transpiration. So this is the actual evapotranspiration. And it's a function of the atmospheric demand for water due to solar energy. So actual evapotranspiration is highly tied to net radiation and the supply of water from precipitation. So actual evapotranspiration accounts for solar radiation and precipitation. Now let's look at these two maps of potential evapotranspiration and evapotranspiration. If you look at these maps, you might see really big differences in where you have water holding capacity, and mostly it's in these areas. So this is actual evapotranspiration is really low here, but very high in the same geographic region for potential, and that's because, why? Well, this is where the Sahara Desert is. If there's a desert area, maybe it has a very high potential to hold evaporation if water were available, but it's a desert and there's no water. So while it may have high potential, in actuality, it's actually got very low evapotranspiration because it's a desert and there's no water. You also can see a little bit of that's really the main difference that I wanted to point out, is where the deserts were, where the very large deserts were. Yeah. Anything else I wanted to say about this? No, that's it. Okay. Yes, I did. Never mind. So you can also see how the annual average temperature also relates to the actual evapotranspiration compared to the potential. There's really high net radiation, but there's also no water, and so that's why the actual evapotranspiration is low. Some of these patterns of species richness are also related to the productivity of the ecosystems that occur in different geographic ranges. Globally, you see a strong positive correlation between PET and AET, so potential and actual evapotranspiration, and species richness. And then you also see a strong positive correlation. First let's talk about this. So you got strong positive correlation between potential evapotranspiration and actual and species richness. These are some graphs that are showing potential evapotranspiration and species richness. Now, it does seem to plateau in a lot of groups, not particularly so much in reptiles, but you do see a positive correlation between species richness and evapotranspiration. Now, these are all animals, and obviously water availability is going to dictate the number of species probably that an environment can hold, and so that's why there's probably a relationship between species richness and potential evapotranspiration. Now, you also can see a strong positive correlation between actual evapotranspiration and net primary productivity. Now, why might that be? I'll let you think about it for a minute. Did you say because photosynthetic organisms rely on a water source? Well, then you'd be right. So, actual evapotranspiration is related to water availability in the environment, and photosynthetic organisms will require water to be primary producers. And so that's why net primary productivity, the amount of the photosynthetic capability of an environment, is directly tied to evapotranspiration. You also see a strong positive correlation between, I just said that. You also see one between, and I just said that too. Dang it. Okay, well, here's some other stuff looking at the correlation between PET and AET and species richness of plants, which again relates back to net primary productivity. You see a really strong correlation here with trees, and then this is just general. I think this is a vascular plant species richness, again highlighting this positive correlation. You also see a strong correlation between net primary productivity and species richness, which we talked about. Net primary productivity is basically a measure of the photosynthetic capabilities of an environment. And so you would imagine that the higher the net primary productivity of an environment, the more plant species that environment can hold, because it has an increased photosynthetic capability of that environment. So here you see increase in tree species richness along with primary production. And then here's just general species richness and how that correlates with tree species richness. So again, a lot of these correlations are very intuitive with what we know about cellular processes and what abiotic factors certain organisms need to grow and survive and thrive. You can also see a positive correlation between animal species richness and NPP. So NPP is a measure of primary production. Primary production is from autotrophs, things that photosynthesize, at least in terrestrial environments. Basically, with the exception of hydrothermal vents, NPP is relative to photosynthetic organisms in the environment. And we know that the heterotrophs in those environments depend on the autotrophs in those environments. So autotroph diversity is going to be directly related to heterotroph diversity, and therefore heterotroph diversity is going to be positively correlated with NPP, which might be the causal relationship between animal species richness and NPP. But mostly what we've been talking about here, these correlations, these global patterns, is talking about terrestrial environments. Let's talk about what's going on in marine environments. What you see in marine environments is that species richness does decline with increasing latitude. So you have high species richness in the ocean at low latitudes around the equator, but primary productivity of marine environments declines with increasing species richness. As seasonal fluctuations in temperature on primary productivity increases, species richness declines, and you have species dominance. So why might this be? Why might you see an inverse relationship with latitude in primary productivity in marine environments? Now think a little bit about what you know about what primary productivity is and marine diversity. if we think about what the primary producers are in open water environments, which we just covered very recently in nutrient cycling, we know that the primary producers in marine environments are going to be phytoplankton growing at the surface. Those phytoplankton depend on nutrient cycling in those environments, and we know that seasonal variation in temperature greatly influences nutrient cycling in aquatic environments. So, seasonal variation in the temperature of surface waters functions to increase primary productivity. Let's go all the way back to some of our very first lectures where we talked about aquatic environments. You know that in aquatic environments, water circulates in those environments more in temperature fluctuating environments because cold water sinks to the bottom and warmer water will rise, and it causes a circulation in the water in that environment. That circulation and movement of water because of seasonal variation in temperature then causes nutrient cycling. And so if a body of water is warm all the time, you're going to have pretty stable stratification, a very stable thermocline in that environment. And with that stable thermocline comes reduced movement of water. With reduced movement of water, you have reduced nutrient cycling in that environment. And with reduced nutrient cycling comes lower net primary productivity. Hopefully, all that makes sense. If it doesn't, we will have an exam review before the final exam to cover it. I know it's a little confusing, but think about the relationship between seasonal temperature, the movement of water in aquatic environments, how that affects nutrient cycling, and then how nutrient cycling affects primary productivity. And that will bring you to the answer of why you see this inverse relationship between latitude and NPP in marine environments. So, you actually see when there's a lack of seasonal variation, which you get at the equator in marine environments, that actually functions to support a higher diversity of life and animals, but you need that seasonal variation for those photosynthetic organisms to grow at the surface, and so that's why NPP is lower at the equator. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, let me know. Terrestrial vertebrate species richness tends to be more related to temperature than to potential evapotranspiration and actual evapotranspiration. Why might that be? Think about the physiology of animals and why temperature might be more related to vertebrate species richness. Let's think about it. Did you say because temperature has a huge effect on the physiology of organisms and their thermal limits? Well, then you would be correct. Temperature is going to, especially for things that do not thermoregulate, temperature can have a huge effect on animal physiology and reproduction. So that's why you might see a closer relationship between temperature and terrestrial vertebrates rather than between PET and AET. You also see a negative relation between species richness and elevation, which we will talk about on the next slide. But before I go to that, I want to say in both terrestrial and marine environments, there is a consistent relationship between the direct flux of energy to the surface and patterns of species richness. So, let's talk about species richness and elevation. What factors might explain why species richness is negatively correlated with elevation? Let's think about that a little bit. We know that temperatures tend to be colder at higher elevations. We know that warmer seasons tend to be shorter at higher elevations. And you also learned in the terrestrial ecosystems lecture, well, maybe not actually, I didn't talk so much about elevation, but a lot of tundra environments, like polar tundra environments that have almost no species diversity at all, tend to be at very, very high elevations. That's why they might have lower species richness at higher elevations, but that's also confounded by the fact that high elevation sites, just by their topography, tend to be smaller, and then they also are more isolated, so it's harder for organisms to get to them in the first place, which might also be why species richness is lower at higher elevations. Oh, and then this is just a graph of bird species by altitude. You can see decreasing bird species. Mammal species decreases with altitude, and so does plants. Those are some of the reasons. And now let's come back to something you learned about in lab and that you calculated with some of the data we collected. Let's talk about different ways of measuring diversity at different scales across large landscapes. One way is alpha diversity. Alpha diversity is species diversity at the spatial scale of individual communities. So alpha diversity might be within one of these squares. Beta diversity is the variation in species diversity among sites in a geographic area. So what might result in high beta diversity? Let's think about the sites that we looked at. Well, I only had you calculate beta diversity for insects, but let's think about plants for a second. If you have like a prairie like Winnie Palmer next to a forested site, like you also have at Winnie Palmer, and then you also have a wetland site, if we're looking at species diversity among all those sites that are all within a single community, you'll have high beta diversity. But if, let's say, all of that area happened to be prairie, you'd have lower beta diversity. So we have high plant beta diversity at where we are at St. Vincent College. Now let's talk about gamma diversity. That is the total species diversity or species richness across all communities within a certain geographic area. So that's gamma diversity. And these are just different maps looking at species diversity. And then, as you can see, species diversity is not static throughout time. This is summer and winter patterns of bird species richness. It's changing over time with these maps because birds migrate, animals move, and they disperse, and they migrate, and populations go extinct, and there might be recolonization events. And so species diversity is not static. It can have seasonal variation, as you see here. There's clearly higher bird diversity, at least in Pennsylvania and in our area. Oh, look at that. There's like a slightly higher bird diversity down here where we are compared to the rest of Pennsylvania. And then it's lower in the winter when birds migrate. It can change through time too. So that's just some things, just a way to, this whole lecture is kind of just to introduce you to how to think about species and ecology, species diversity and ecology at a global scale, and try to think about how global processes like climatic patterns, trade winds, solar radiation can help you think about and explain patterns in ecology at a global scale. So, now that I've got you thinking about ecology at a global scale. I'm hoping that you'll be prepared to then think about our last lecture, which will be on the ecology of climate change. We're almost there, y'all. Stay tuned for the very last chapter of the end. Okay, bye-bye.